Describe is where we basically wire together the dependencies between deployments. Class loaders, we actually create the class loader for that deployment. And beyond that point, we actually have the proper class loader is defined by the deployment, which could entail isolated deployments, with that are only exposing classes and resources specific to that deployment. It can include resources and classes from other externalized bundles. For example, if I'm using an OSGI style model, I can be importing classes and resources from OSGI bundles, and obviously that's extensible. So for example, if we're going to add support for the Java module system, that's where we would introduce a class loader that understood those semantics. Post-class loader is where I have deployers that start to introduce or manipulate metadata based on class related, or resources they have to load through the class loader. So the most obvious thing in the Java EE5 and later models is that's where I would have to parse annotations, because annotations can potentially be local to the deployment. The WebBeans or JSR 299 spec allows for annotations that are customized, defined by the deployment itself. So they only exist in the deployment. They're not necessarily a proper part of the JBoss application server class path. FreeReals is kind of a last chance. If you're a deployer that wants to not run in the real stage queue, you don't actually create components, but you still need to manipulate things post all these other phases, introduction of annotations, all the previous metadata parsing. You still have a chance there to manipulate the metadata. That finally goes into the real deployers, and the real deployers are basically deployers that have a concrete component model where they take a metadata view and then create the actual instances. So two examples of real deployers in the JBoss application server out of the box are the Pojo MC component model, which is creating our MC beans, and then obviously our legacy MBean service MBeans. So the JBoss service.xml stuff used in 4.2, we have a deployer that takes that metadata and then creates the MBeans, the JBoss service lifecycle MBeans. Installed is the finalized, fully instantiated and running state of the components. So let me quickly take a look at a couple parsing deployers that we have as base classes, because this is the most obvious place where you would introduce your own custom behavior. The schema resolve deployer is a deployer that takes a given input file and produces a metadata output of a given type T. And it basically integrates with our JBoss XB and JAXB parsing layers. So it can be driven off of either schema-driven deployments or JAXB annotation style deployments. So you're basically saying, this is the root class of my metadata. If you see this metadata either as a schema, annotated with a schema, or with a JAXB root annotation, that's all you need to do to basically take that externalized view and bring it into the metadata for the given deployment. More generalized version of those are basically just hooks that allow you to be told that a file of a given type or suffix exists in the deployment as a virtual file, and then you can do whatever custom parsing you want. And I'll show you an example of a properties file that basically gets transformed from that properties file view into a JBoss MCBean metadata view. Another example of that would be if you have a foreign non-native JBoss metadata model like Spring Beans, you could write a deployer that takes the Spring Beans format and basically rewrites that as metadata all of the JBoss MCBeans metadata view. And then our existing Pojo real component deployer would take that and create the MCBeans and do the dependency injection and wiring across those beans. So an existing Spring deployment could be transparently migrated via that mechanism. Some of the other common deployers are the schema resolver deployer. Actually, that's what I just talked about. The abstract VFS parsing deployer is if I don't have necessarily a schema or a JAXB binding model, I want it to be told when an existing virtual file of a given pattern matches or is found in the metadata locations of my deployment. Let me know that so that I can parse that into via my own custom mechanism. Maybe I'm using JAXB or some other XML object binding model. The abstract class loader describe deployer is a place where you can introduce customizing behavior with respect to the class loading metadata model that we've defined as a superset of the OSGI bundle and Java module systems. So if you're introducing custom class loading behavior, you could use that. The abstract class loader deployer is the deployer that takes that metadata model and actually instantiate the existing class loader. So if you want to actually control how the class loader metadata model is instantiated into a class loader, you would simply replace that class loader or that deployer in the JBoss application server configuration. A couple of the real or component-oriented deployers that you're likely to use are the abstract component deployer. There, the notion is that my deployment is a collection of components. So I may have a containing metadata view, like in our models, it's going to be a kernel deployment, an ear, or a service MBean descriptor deployment. And the components inside those would be the POJO MBeans, or the POJO beans, the service MBeans, or the EJBs. Right? That's a typical pattern in deployments. Is I have this container with components, and this facilitates that model. The other real deployer that you're likely to use if you want to take complete control of how do I transform a piece of metadata into an actual instantiated component is this abstract simple real deployer. And there, typically you're going to take the final form of the metadata. For example, in the POJO model, it's a bean metadata view. In the JBoss service metadata view, it would be a JBoss service metadata. If I wanted to have basically a customized MBean view, I might have something like an MBean info that I take and actually instantiate the MBeans into the JAMX kernel via a custom deployer. Okay. So just a couple examples of typically how easy it is to introduce new metadata via one of those deployers. I mean, here's what our EJB parsing deployer looks like. So this is the deployer for the standard EJB jar XML metadata model, right? So basically, all that's saying is that for this, I want to register that this, a metadata file matching this pattern is going to have a schema associated with it. You need to look up that schema and then run the JAXB or JBoss XB parsing to produce the metadata, which is a subclass of EJB jar metadata. An example of a customized non-native JBoss format would be this one, where let's say I've come up with a simplified POJO, a simplified properties file view of our JBoss microcontainer POJO. So basically, you would state the class and then have a simple declaration of the properties, based on a properties text file. How would I introduce and actually create JBoss microcontainer POJOs given that model? Well, what I would need to do is create a parsing deployer that translated that properties file into the existing JBoss specific metadata. So in this case, we're declaring that I have an extension of the abstract VFS parsing deployer that's going to output the kernel deployment. The kernel deployment is our JBoss-beans.xml metadata model. So I define a new custom suffix -beans.properties. And initialization is basically just setting the kernel metadata name to the properties file name.